He's one of the most cherished icons in the history of television, but behind the camera, the magic often came with challenges no one saw. When they first met, she was young, 12 years his junior, and completely new to comedy. Her elegant, almost old Hollywood accent gave her an air of sophistication, but it also raised questions about whether she could truly fit into the fast-paced world of sitcoms. He had doubts. She had never even done comedy before. Yet what unfolded between them was nothing short of remarkable. Their chemistry lit up the screen, but the story behind their partnership is far more complex, and deeply surprising. Charming, funny, and seemingly full of light, Dick Van Dyke spent nearly a century making the world laugh. But now, after decades of silence, he's finally pulling back the curtain on the shadows behind the spotlight. The truth is far from the cheerful image we've all held. Behind those timeless performances were moments of deep hurt, professional betrayals, and personal disappointments that never made it to air. There are 6 names, some legendary, some deeply personal. One nearly ruined a television classic, and another left wounds he never truly healed from. Among them was Mary Tyler Moore. On screen, they were America's sweethearts, flawless timing, natural chemistry, and laughter that felt real. But off-screen, the dynamic was far more complicated. What really happened behind those picture-perfect smiles? Why did it take him this long to reveal it all? The answers are raw, emotional, and impossible to forget. Behind the polished smiles and perfect timing of the Dick Van Dyke Show lay emotions far more complex than any script could capture. Dick Van Dyke would later confess what many fans had long suspected: he harbored a quiet, unspoken crush on Mary Tyler Moore. It was a feeling he never acted on, buried deep beneath professionalism, but it brought a subtle, undeniable tension to every scene they shared. When the show began in 1961, Mary was just 25, 11 years his junior, and Dick openly questioned whether she was the right choice for the role. He told creator Carl Reiner she seemed too young to play his wife, but Reiner brushed off the concern, insisting audiences wouldn't care. And he was right. The moment Mary stepped into the role of Laura Petrie, the chemistry was electric, and the age gap faded from sight. Yet, that initial doubt lingered in Dick's mind, quietly feeding the complex emotions that grew as the show went on. Their on-set relationship deepened, wrapped in the pressure of tight filming schedules and the intimacy of a small, close-knit cast. Everyone knew each other's rhythms, moods, and hidden truths. For Dick, working so closely with Mary, laughing, improvising, creating magic, only intensified the emotions he tried to suppress. He later admitted that while nothing ever crossed the line, the feelings between them formed a silent current beneath the show's iconic charm, one that made each scene feel more real, and more complicated, than anyone watching could ever imagine. They spent countless hours side by side, filming, rehearsing, attending press events, slowly building a bond that blurred the lines between performance and reality. Though they never crossed any boundaries, the emotional current between them never truly disappeared. What played out on screen wasn't just good acting, it carried a raw undercurrent of something deeper, something unsaid. Mary once joked in an interview, "The amazing thing is, we never had an affair. I always thought it was a terrible waste." Her words, delivered with a smile, carried more truth than humor. Both knew the connection they shared could have easily turned into something real, but life had other plans. Dick was married. Mary had her own relationships. So instead, they performed a delicate dance of restraint, one that added undeniable chemistry to their scenes and quiet complexity to every off-camera interaction. As the Dick Van Dyke Show grew into a cultural phenomenon, the spotlight slowly shifted. While Dick was still the lead, it was Mary who began capturing hearts in a way that surprised even the producers. Her style, wit, and radiant presence made her a sensation. Fans adored her, critics praised her, and soon, Mary wasn't just a co-star, she was the star. Dick, ever gracious, watched this transformation with a mix of admiration and quiet reflection. The woman he once questioned as too young for the role had become television royalty, and their dynamic, once grounded in equal footing, had subtly shifted. What remained between them was respect, unspoken affection, and a bittersweet knowledge of what might have been. Even though he never showed jealousy, it was a noticeable shift. Everyone was discussing Mary. The media desired her. She was adored by audiences. The producers then began writing more and more to highlight her skills. Not everyone had this experience. Rosemary, who portrayed Sally Rogers, believed she would co-star with her as Julie Adams. But soon that modest name began to feel constrained as Mary gained more and more notoriety. Then, on the set, the tension became evident. Dyke appeared to be torn between keeping the show's face, which had his name in the title, and moving in different ways. He was suddenly caught between a co-star he genuinely admired a bit too much and a castmate who felt neglected. Dyke, however, never made any harsh or disparaging remarks about Mary. He valued her professionalism, her abilities, and her intuition. However, he claimed that dealing with Mary was emotionally draining. He had to keep an eye on feelings that he couldn't share with anyone, not because she was challenging. It was a subtle type of hungering away at you every day, not even a crush on a coworker. For years, he kept it in storage and never let it go. In retrospect, like Mary, he described it as a dreadful waste. It's one of the few Hollywood tales where drama or treachery doesn't break the heart. Instead, it comes from the self-respect of two individuals who have good intentions without destroying something that is already magical. However, he clung to that love-filled quiet, which came back to haunt him, influencing his recollections of the program and making Mary Tyler Moore a co-star he would never forget but would never fully forgive for adoring. It wasn't a contrived tension between them. We promise that the next unveiling will be much more devastating. Rosemary. Rosemary believed she understood exactly where she stood in the early days of the Dyke Van Dyke show. When she agreed to play Sally Rogers, she was a vaudeville icon, a seasoned comedy veteran, and one of the few women in Hollywood who could joke around with any man in the room. She thought she would be the female lead in the program. Mary Tyler Moore, who was only 25 at the time, was cast in what was previously thought to be a supporting role and was largely unknown. However, Rosemary never forgot the swift change in authority. Mary Tyler Moore became as the show's breakout star as it grew in popularity. Laura Petrie, the role she played, was more than just a devoted housewife. She was pleasant, humorous, and a natural scene stealer. She was adored by audiences. Producers took note. Abruptly, the program that was meant to highlight Rob's professional life started to concentrate more on his personal life. This change resulted in fewer script pages and fewer punchlines for Rosemary's Sally Rogers. Before long, Rosemary began to express her annoyance. She went straight to Carl Reiner, the show's creator, and expressed her dissatisfaction. Her voice and wit had been the foundation of her career, and now she was being subtly pushed to the sidelines. She blamed the show's newfound obsession with Mary for her perceived undervaluation of her skills. It wasn't a subtle tension. It was evident in every read-through and practice for the cast and crew. Reiner made an effort to defuse the situation, but in typical Hollywood manner, his efforts simply made matters worse. According to reports, he said to Mary and Rosemary, "You both have excellent legs. All they want to do is gaze at hers." What was intended to be a joke came over as contemptuous. Rosemary also took offense. She wasn't using appearance to compete for attention. She desired to be known for her skill, timing, and comedic abilities. It was painful to be reduced to a remark about legs. Dyke Van Dyke found himself in the center. He held Rosemary in the highest regard. He was aware of what was going on with Mary, but he also understood that her sense of humor was sound. Even the network was surprised by how well her character connected with viewers. For Dyke, the set resembled a quiet battlefield. Many times, the laughter you heard in the performance was precisely what you needed to take your mind off of your frustrations and shattered egos. Nevertheless, Rosemary never let any of that influence her work. Like any competent professional, she would arrive, hit her targets, and deliver each punchline. However, the years have passed, and she still harbors that animosity. She logically repeatedly drew light to the disparity in subsequent interviews. It seemed to her that she had been promised one thing and received another. Even if she didn't blame Mary specifically, the hurt of being eclipsed by someone younger and more recent never quite went away. Dick found it difficult to watch Rosemary grow more aloof. He and Rose were close friends when they first started the show. But when attention shifted away from her, so did their adorable friendship. A pretty subtle competitiveness replaced the delight of group comedy. There was always this sense that something wasn't quite right in that other realm, even during the show's peak, when the ratings were skyrocketing. Following the success of the Dick Van Dyke Show, Mary Tyler Moore rose to fame on television. But for Rosemary, it was a bittersweet moment that included both emotional disappointment and professional pride. He continued to be a huge fan of her talent. However, their relationship was no longer as straightforward or friendly as it had been. Arguments and controversies frequently failed to reveal the deepest rifts. All it takes to make them is a silent replacement. Erickson, Phil. Dick Van Dyke was half of a two-man comic act that tried to make people laugh silently before he became a TV celebrity. No one had ever seen the Merry Mutes, Eric and Van, together before. They remained silent. They didn't sing. They pantomimed stories and lip-synced old music so well that viewers couldn't take their eyes off them. It was witty, ridiculous, and entirely unique. However, the chemistry between Dick and Phil Erickson, the man who had faith in Dick before anyone else did, was what really made it magical. When Van Dyke was just 22 years old and hosting a local morning radio show in 1947, they first crossed paths. The teenage DJ's timing and physical humor struck a chord with Erickson, who was already a skilled mimic. He offered a straightforward idea. "Let's work together." Dick's life was altered by that offer. They performed 5 shows a night, often 7 nights a week, as they pounded the club scene. They performed 35 gigs in a single week in 1950, setting a record. Van Dyke thought they were about to experience something monumental. Then the long-awaited break arrived. In 1951, the Merry Mutes aired their own television program on Atlanta's WSB-TV. Their performance blew up. In 1952, they received an invitation to appear on The Ed Sullivan Show, which at the time was the largest stage on television. One routine, a football sketch in slow motion, went viral across the country. Dick felt for the first time that he was a real member of the entertainment industry. But everything fell apart as quickly as it had come together. Phil Erickson walked away in 1953. Just gone, no argument, no controversy, no betrayal. Dick was left speechless and adrift when he made the decision to completely leave the entertainment industry. Dick subsequently stated, "We were just getting started, the decision was never really clear to him." There was no lengthy farewell, no discussion of fatigue or regrets. They were practicing at one point. Then Dick was left alone. Partners drift in show business, but this felt like a betrayal. It never seemed like Van Dyke was one for publicly criticizing Phil. He wasn't a man like that. But when he had to discuss that chapter, the agony was obvious. He discovered someone who shared his imagination, drive, and rhythm. And it was lost just as they were starting to construct something together. Furthermore, this was not a creative conflict or one of the well-known Hollywood feuds. Simply said, it was quite silent. And a different impression was produced by this quiet. Over the next few years, Dick continued to annoy people. He hosted TV shows, tried and failed to run a game show, and landed small sitcom parts. Erickson had a sense of security and creative fulfillment that none of them really seemed to provide. In essence, he needed to rebuild both professionally and emotionally. It takes a long time to recover from this downward spiral because it involves the unexpected departure of one's first creative soulmate. After that, trust is difficult to regain. The dissolution of the Merry Mutes would be cited by Van Dyke years later as one of the pivotal moments in his career. It strengthened his fortitude and increased his vigilance. It was more than the conclusion of a performance. A time when everything could have gone one way but didn't was coming to an end. In order to prove to himself and the industry that he could succeed without a partner, it toughened him, forced him to work harder, and extended his hours. Ultimately, Van Dijk became a living legend, while Eriksson fell into obscurity. Still, he was haunted by the ghost of that early collaboration. In Dyke's case, the man who launched his career also taught him his first real-life lesson about heartbreak, proving that often the most difficult breakups are those that don't involve romance. In many respects, Dyke's subsequent partnerships were all influenced by Phil's departure. At a young age, he discovered that chemistry was not something that could be tried out for. It either ignited or didn't. He was tired of ever depending on anyone again after the sudden loss of that spark. Dyke became into the solo resilience master as his career took off, capable of carrying a show, helping a scene partner, or captivating a live audience by himself. Beneath that freedom was a silent anguish, the awareness that he had once been matched with someone who made the work seem so effortless. Imagine what it's like when the man who made you walk away, if losing a lover felt like being abandoned. Rainer Karl. The Dyke Van Dijk program was not the only creation of Karl Rainer. Dyke Van Dyke's career was influenced by him. Rainer originally intended to play the lead role in the musical, which was based on his own life. Rainer, however, took the decision to give Dyke the part when CBS execs were hesitant. Just 18 days before production began, it was a last-minute risk that altered the course of television history. Van Dyke was thrust into the limelight and given the opportunity to take the stage for the first time. However, the power dynamic was evident right away. Dyke was working inside someone else's vision, and this was Karl's show. The partnership was successful at first. Karl skillfully scripted, directed, and controlled the show's tone. Dyke, who was still establishing his career, was appreciative of the advice. Van Dijk, however, began to want more input as the show settled into a groove and shot to the top of the ratings. Despite being America's favorite spouse and the face of the series, he frequently felt like a visitor in someone else's creative home. Decisions weren't his when they were made. Karl, not Dyke, stepped in to mediate conflicts between cast members, such as the rivalry between Rosemary and Mary Tyler Moore. Despite his brilliance, Rainer was unyielding. Dyke once acknowledged that Karl had to approve even the smallest set suggestions. Tone, casting, and scripts were all strictly regulated. Ironically, Dyke had less freedom as a result of the show's enormous success. He had a great deal of respect for Karl, but he was angry that he was unable to influence the thing that he was helping to make famous. Behind the scenes, Dyke was silently battling creative angst while the rest of the world watched a flawless sitcom. Their paths parted after the conclusion of the first show. However, Karl returned as a writer and advisor when Van Dijk started the new Dyke Van Dijk program in 1971. It was a different setup. The show was marketed as more contemporary, even edgy, and Dyke hosted a discussion show in Arizona. It addressed issues such as marriages without children and interracial couples. Dyke was eager to do something new that would capture the shifting cultural landscape of the 1970s. CBS wasn't prepared, though. An episode that addressed a contentious topic, Lieutenant Preston of the 4th Cavalry, was omitted. The episode made Van Dijk very proud. It was written by Karl Rainer, but CBS abruptly cancelled it. For both of them, that was a slap in the face. And for Rainer, that was the last straw. He simply walked out of the show without saying anything. No public backlash, no protracted battle, simply gone. It was a catastrophe for Dyke. Rainer had been his friend, collaborator, and guru. Then he was gone, without warning. The show didn't feel like it had Karl's writing anymore. The heart was no longer there, but the ratings were already on the decline. Later, Dyke remarked that it seemed as though the entire breeze beneath that show had been shot down. In slow motion, what started off as a chance to be extremely daring and intimate turned out to be a failure. In 1974, the second series ran for just 3 seasons. The damage was still there, but the project had not burned to the ground like others in Hollywood. With Reiner, Van Dyke always walked a tightrope. Thankful pupil but irritated performance. Although their collaboration was fantastic, Dick was cursed with the consequences of working in someone else's shadow. Dick discovered that even success turns become a prison if you are never given a voice in decision-making. Van Dyke and Reiner continued to be friends in the years that followed. Every now and then they'd get an occasional dinner together, however the preliminary dynamic, in which one man created the arena and the other simply lived in it, would never totally vanish. Dick might provide credit score to Carl for the begin of his career, but he held a grudge for the constricted space for boom he had been given in it. On occasion the toughest breakups don't come with shouting. They arrive with silence, with a person taking walks off the set and never coming back. That creative tension remained with Dick lengthy once they ended shooting. On every occasion he obtained a new offer, he could weigh no longer most effective the pay, however also how lots freedom he would get to exercise. The Reiner years imparted a high-priced lesson. Being the major big name did not necessarily imply having a say. Admiring Carl's genius left Dick cautious, a chunk bitter. Years later, Dick would laud their friendship, but one ought to experience a hesitance while it came to innovative freedom. He had vowed in no way to be placed in one of these powerless scenarios besides, no longer even within a genius's grasp. It wasn't precisely a feud. It was greater like an innovative partnership that gave after which took away. Walt Disney gave Dick Van Dyke the position that turned him into a worldwide famous person. In Mary Poppins, Dick played Bert, the happy-go-lucky chimney sweep who danced throughout rooftops and into movie records. However, behind the scenes of the magical movie was a story a long way much less whimsical. Because whilst Walt opened the door for Van Dyke, he additionally permit him stroll into a storm without safety. And for Dick, that left a scar deeper than any critic's review. From the start, Van Dyke needed to fight for his vicinity inside the movie. Disney didn't want him to play the second position, Mr. Dawes Sr., the elderly bank director. Dick desired the part badly sufficient that he paid for his very own screen test and even eliminated his fake enamel to look older. To maximum actors, this will have been beneath them. But for Van Dyke, it wasn't approximately ego. It turned into approximately proving he should do extra than sing and smile. Walt in the end agreed, however the manner it changed into dealt with made it clean. Dick had to earn every inch of area inside the Disney International. Then came the accessory, the notorious, often ridiculed Cockney accessory that observed Van Dyke for many years. It had become a punchline in pop culture. However, what the majority don't know is that Van Dyke wasn't given proper training. His dialect coach changed into Irish and by his own admission, not any higher at it than he turned into. Van Dyke failed to know it become that bad until audiences reacted. The worst part, no one on set ever pulled him apart. Now not Disney, no longer the director, no longer a single manufacturer. They let him stroll into cinematic records with an accent that could hang out him for existence. Decades later, Van Dyke nevertheless joked about it, calling it the worst Cockney accessory in movie history, but the laughter masked the actual bitterness. He'd worked himself to the bone, actually finishing the grueling step-in time dance scene over 23 takes at age 41, and poured the whole thing into that overall performance. He sang, danced, acted, and even took on a 2D function. However, in preference to being praised for his versatility, he was mocked. And Walt Disney, he in no way stepped as much as protect him. Van Dyke changed into not merely a hired actor. He became a person who remained loyal to the undertaking in a way human beings rarely are. Van Dyke by no means widespread any fee for gambling Bert. The reality is he worked without spending a dime on one of the maximum iconic elements in cinema because he believed so heavily inside the movie. And whilst the backlash arose, Disney left him to take all the punches. No one blanketed the man Walt had put forward for the process. In Hollywood, this form of silence contains a sturdy weight. Years later, Van Dyke might continually reward Walt Disney pronouncing he believed in me. Intermixed with he turned into a genius. However, there had constantly been a quiver of hesitation in that voice, gratefulness layered with the quietest form of regret. Because Dick knew deep inner that belief had its obstacles. The moment public safety got here, Disney allowed the narrative shift and Van Dyke became the punchline to the very equal profession defining second. What's even more unusual, thanks to the accent and backstage overlook, Mary Poppins became a roaring achievement with domestic income surpassing $100 million, which made Van Dyke an in a single-day sensation. But with that success, there usually came the shadows. Every time any individual attempted mimicking his accessory or ridiculing his overall performance, he changed into reminded of ways he came into it. Now not being guided, however being thrown into it. And Walt let him sink or swim. Proper antique Walt. Ultimately, Van Dyke in no way pretty received the credit he deserved for Mary Poppins. He gave it his all. His voice, his frame, his pride. And while Bert was cherished everywhere in the world, Dick couldn't forget how exposed he were on that stage. For all of the magic that the House of Mouse promised, he had discovered a bitter fact. From time to time the man who opens the door is the identical one who leaves you status out inside the rain. On the contrary, what sincerely harmed changed into the exchange in Dick's faith concerning agree within Hollywood, which such an experience delivered about. He got herein with the conviction that loyalty, ardor, and skills would suffice. That if you gave your heart to a studio, they would lower back you. What he found out as an alternative became that even the top-notch Walt Disney might be forgotten while the criticisms began to fly. From that event onwards, Dick grew extra guarded with his collaborators. He brought the joy of being to his paintings. However, after that occasion no longer assumed each person in Hollywood might guide him. That lack of faith did no longer make him grow bitter. It made him grow wise. But it also left a quiet scar that walked with him on each movie and in the course of every interview that followed. Hold your expectancies constant because this top tale strips the magic proper off the display. Himself haunted via repute and remorse. Dick Van Dyke made hundreds of thousands snigger. However, for decades, he could not even look in the reflect. Even as audiences noticed the charming track and dance guy on screen, behind the scenes turned into a person he barely identified. A person slipping deeper into dependency, infidelity, and disgrace. Repute did not simply trade his lifestyles. It cut up it in two. There was the version the sector cherished and the model he kept hidden from everyone together with himself. It began in his 30s, right around the time the Dick Van Dyke show made him a household name. He turned into surrounded via parties, achievement, and pressure to be on all the time. So he began consuming only a little at the start, something to loosen up at social events, however it crept in speedy. Before he knew it, it wasn't just an awful dependency. It became a full-blown dependency. He stated it himself. He changed into shocked at how quickly the alcohol took over. With the aid of the 1970s, the man who once lit up TV screens became drowning at the back of closed doors. He'd become angry, withdrawn, and moody. Phrases that did not even seem to belong to the Dick Van Dyke people idea they knew. He checked himself into a sanatorium in 1972 seeking to get easy. It turned into a courageous circulate, but it wasn't the give-up of the story. Recovery is hardly ever a directly line, and for Dick, the emotional damage went deeper than the consuming. His marriage to Margie Willett had already been strained with the aid of reputation, distance, and conflicting life. She hated Hollywood. He could not leave it. And then whilst nonetheless legally married, Dick started out an affair with Michelle Triola. At the beginning, it became innocent. Smartphone calls, lunches, however it speedy spiraled right into a full relationship. He attempted to juggle each lives, husband and father by way of day, secret partner by using night time. It tore him apart. Their marriage crumbled. After 36 years collectively, they divorced in 1984. For a person adored for portraying the all-American father, this turned into a horrendous time. He recounted later that the guilt of those years almost smothered him. At the same time as the general public noticed a person quite healthful, he felt inwardly like a phony. Even his long-standing love of the following 30 years with Michelle changed into a lie that he never pretty forgave himself for. The hardest part understanding it never had to be. Dick said reputation affected him. However, not in an ostentatiously flaunting Cavalian power form of way. It changed into a gradual erosion of his very sense of self that numbed his soul. He became someone who harmed other human beings. Someone he used to judge. And that became the unsettling part that haunted him long after the applause had diminished. During his later years, Dick spoke with brutal honesty all through interviews. He mentioned the fear he felt, approximately what he noticed within himself for the duration of the darkest days. He said he was now not the person his admirers believed him to be, however he did not pull away from it. He owned it. He wrote a totally honest memoir. He spoke at restoration activities. He turned that very same platform that almost tempted him into self-destruction, right into a begging publish to tug humans from the brink. Dick Van Dyke is 99 years old these days and nonetheless dances, nevertheless smiles. However, his wars have been no longer fought on a degree. They have been fought inside the silence of his very own guilt, regret, and redemption. Finest enemies have been not co-stars or studio executives. They were the sunglasses of selfhood that fame nearly created. And the miracle isn't always even that he survived it. The miracle is that he came lower back and is now more potent. Dick Van Dyke found himself alone often in the course of the quiet moments in among laughter and the highlight. Not in a physical sense, for they had been always fanatics and co-workers and handlers surrounding him, but in an emotional sense. The extra people cherished him, the more he disconnected from that photo. The toughest part, he as soon as stated, wasn't ingesting or even the disgrace. It become waking up every morning to position at the show. The entertainer, the optimist, the attempt-less looking, the whole lot. But in the back of the partitions, it weighs heavily. He wasn't just running from his mistakes. He was mourning the identity that he was once long before all of this reputation rewrote the storyline of his existence. Thank you for watching. If you loved this deep dive into the untold stories in the back of Dick Van Dyke's mythical profession, don't forget to love, drop a remark with your mind, and subscribe for greater behind-the-scenes drama and Hollywood history. And don't pass anywhere. Click the video to your display to watch the next tale we recognize you will love.